Hello. Well, I'm sorry that I couldn't join you live in GovComms, but it's a pleasure to speak with you today about organisational listening. And so in starting off, let me ask a pertinent question, and very simply, what is communication? Because we often believe we know what communication is, but it's worth reflecting that it is derived from the Latin noun communis, which means community, and communicare, which is the Latin verb to create. Communication is about creating shared meaning and understanding, commonness in understanding. It's not about the transmission of information. And so if we start with the view that comms, as we like to call it, is sending out information, then listening is not particularly relevant. But if we come back to the fundamental that communication is about achieving an outcome, a shared meaning and an understanding, that's not possible without listening. We also look at definitions. The leading communication researcher, Robert Craig, says communication is very simply speaking and listening. We talk a lot in government about voice and the importance of giving people voice. But as Nick Couldry says, voice is the implicitly linked practices of speaking and listening. And if there's no listening, voice is devalued. Within literature like public relations, we see a lot of emphasis on two-way, on dialogue, and on relationships. And in government and corporate communication, we talk a lot about the importance of insights, engagement, and relationships. And so it behoves us then to look at and say, well, where is the listening in public communication and in government communication included? What we find in the research is that there is an enormous amount of research and study of interpersonal listening in areas like psychology, in leadership studies, in HR, and even in therapeutic fields. And of course, interpersonal listening is very important. But how do organizations listen or don't listen? And what we find is that's largely ignored. And yet organizations are central to contemporary societies, government departments, government agencies, large corporations, NGOs, and so on. And what I found in my research is that listening is actually quite seldom discussed in literature on politics, sociology, in media studies, in business management even, and in PR and corporate communication. And in my slides, which I'm happy to be available, I've given references in brackets and in the back of the slide deck. So you might ask, well, why does this matter? Well, we've seen a kick up in trust recently in the case of COVID-19, where the public is looking to governments and organizations like the World Health Organization to provide reliable information. But over the past decade, trust in government and business and other organizations has been in serious decline. Disengagement is occurring, what we call the democratic deficit. Employee loyalty and retention has declined. And there's criticism of capitalism and of government. And even where government does its work well, there is still a number of marginalized and disenfranchised groups that are missing out. And so these factors led me to begin what I'm calling the Organisational Listening Project. And this started back in 2014-15. And I'll quickly summarize some of the findings, but right up until the present day. One of the first reports, and these two documents on the left and in the center are both available open source online. The first one is a report of the first stage of my listening project. The second one, Creating a Democracy for Everyone, is a report from my work with the UK government. The right-hand side is a book. So when we come to organisational listening, we might ask, well, do the principles of interpersonal listening apply? Well, certainly some of the basic principles do apply, but organisations are unique in three ways. The first thing is organisations don't need to just listen to one or two people or a small group. Organisations, like government agencies, need to listen at large scale. Thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, sometimes even to millions. That in turn means that listening, we can't always do it with our ears, and listening is delegated to various functions, functions like social and market research, customer relations, public consultation, and so on. And that then in turn leads to the third unique characteristic, is that organizational listening is mostly mediated. It's not direct as a person speaking directly to our ears and us listening. So large scale, delegated, and mediated. So there are some unique issues, and I set out in my research using three main methodologies that I'll mention very briefly. I did in-depth interviews with a large sample of senior I'm calling it communication-related managers, because I did up to 7 interviews in some organizations, because there's no one unit or department that handles communication with various stakeholders. I then did content analysis of a range of documents, because being a researcher, you can't necessarily accept at face value what people say. So I wanted to see reports of consultations, reports of research, evaluations, even job descriptions of what communication was actually occurring on the ground. And in some cases, we triangulated the data by doing field experiments where me and my co-researchers actually contacted organizations and submitted inquiries or questions or comments to see what response we got. Now, very sad to say, and I won't jump ahead too much, but in many cases, we didn't get any response at all. The sites of potential listening I'll very quickly mention. We didn't look only at one place, because social and market research, customer relations, public consultation, these are all areas where listening can potentially occur. Of course, in PR, corporate communication, but also internal communication. We must listen to our internal audiences, but also specifically social media, and also correspondence and complaints. So we looked at a number of sites in organizations. Before I give you share some findings with you, I just want to very quickly define listening, because if we think it's the same thing as hearing, then we're perhaps off to a bad start. Hearing is when a signal arrives. Listening is more about the interpretation of signals and what we do with it. And drawing from a whole range of literature in ethics and in communication and in democratic political theory and psychology, I came up with what I call the 7 canons of listening. And the first one is, you can see, it's recognition of others' right to speak. And of course, that sounds simple, but what that's about is avoiding the politics of listening. Politics of listening is where we listen to some people selectively and we don't listen to others. Listening requires more open listening. Something we learned in the Obama campaigns was the importance of acknowledgement. I meet people today who still have pinned on their office wall or at home an email from an Obama campaign saying they had acknowledging the receipt of a message. But the most important things then are paying attention, interpreting what people are saying to us so we try to understand it, giving consideration to what others say, and making a response of some appropriate type. Now, I say appropriate type because listening does not necessarily require agreement. That's an important distinction. We may not be able to do everything people ask. We may not agree. But the literature says we must acknowledge, pay attention, give consideration to, and respond in some appropriate way. And if we don't respond in some appropriate way, the assumption by people is that we simply are ignoring them. So let's quickly look at a few findings. The Organisational Listening Project, stage 1, was a 2-year study where I talked to 36 corporate and government organisations. I did a lot of travelling, so this was in Australia, but also the UK and in the US, where I spent time in New York and in Washington, DC. And in this stage, I did 104 interviews across the 36 organizations. And I also did observation, where I sat in on things like public consultations or call centers, and I analyzed 400 relevant documents. The second stage, which I'll quickly also report on, is I spent almost 7 months inside the UK government in 2016, which I'll report on. And the third and latest research is actually with a corporation. But even though it's a corporation, I think you'll find some of the findings very interesting, even for government communication. So, stage 1. I'll just give the top line, but across this 2 years of research, what I found is that 80% on average of organizations' so-called communication is spent on what we could summarize as speaking, advertising, media releases, speeches, websites, tweeting, posting, and so forth. In fact, some organizations actually acknowledged when we talked and looked at their practices that up to 95% of what they call communication was actually speaking, disseminating the organization's messages. So there's a lot of, if you like, in a colloquial sense, blah, 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 that we call communication. When organizations do listen, I also found that it's mostly instrumental and very organization-centric. When we do research, we tend to ask the questions that we want to ask and what we want to know about. And also, particularly in the corporate world, but also in political campaigning, we also use listening simply to gain intelligence to help us target people, to understand their vulnerabilities, to understand their needs. And while there is some moral value in understanding people's needs, if we're only using it for targeting them with our messages and our persuasive campaigns, then it's not really listening and communication in the original ethical sense of the term. Social media at the time of my earlier research also, disappointingly, was mostly used for distributing organizations' messages, mostly posting. When I talk to organizations about how they might increase their listening, many have a view that a technology can provide the solution. So the answer came back often, oh, we need to adopt a new platform and that will do all our listening for us. And I argued against this based on the research across these 36 organizations, because what I found is that organizational listening has to be designed into the architecture, what I call an architecture of listening. And I identified 8 elements of that. And the first one was that unless there's a culture for listening, unless the organization wants to listen, then no amount of technology, no amount of effort by the staff is actually going to achieve genuine listening. And so a culture of openness and seeing value in listening is important. The politics of listening need to be addressed. In other words, avoiding selective listening, where we listen to some people, but also opening up to listen to perhaps dissenting voices. And then, of course, an organization in a practical sense needs policies. It needs to decide to listen, but it also needs structures and processes. Interestingly, we have very sophisticated structures and processes for disseminating information. We have agencies and we have teams of staff, but often when you examine organizations, there's very few structures and processes for systematic organizational listening. And of course, technologies can play a part, but you need resources, including staff, and we need skills for listening. And I'm going to give a few examples of what those technologies and resources and skills might be. And finally, very importantly, we need articulation, because if you recall, I said organizational listening is often delegated. It's delegated to teams working in research or working in customer service. And those voices need to be articulated from those units to senior management and policymaking. Let's look at organizational project stage 2, because this was specifically in government. And I had the opportunity to do, and we decided to do participatory action research, because the aim here was to go beyond identifying a problem and say, how can we actually test methods for better engagement? And this occasion, because I was living and working in London, we used ethnography, interviews again, and content analysis. And initially, it was agreed that I would work in one department, the Department of Health. And the study was actually sponsored by the UK Government Communications Service in the Cabinet Office in 70 Whitehall. And very conveniently, the Department of Health at the time was almost directly opposite at 79 Whitehall. And so it began as a small study, and I went to the London to live in May 2016. And on the 23rd of June, just a month later, something big happened. And as you all know, the EU referendum was held, and against all of the polls and all of the government's predictions, of course, the UK voted to leave the EU. Theresa May, in her first week as the new Prime Minister after the resignation of David Cameron and many of his ministers, Theresa May publicly said, we clearly have not been listening to the British people. And my study suddenly became a much bigger study and very intensively over the following months. And I'll just share with you some of the top line findings. We did find positively that at the time, the UK government, like governments elsewhere, here included, had committed very strongly to digital communication, and they were doing I gave it a tick and a minus because some was still posting, but there was quite a bit of digital listening beginning to occur and technologies being brought to bear for that. But I also found still a major focus on campaigns. And campaigns, of course, are about putting out information. Now, campaigns, of course, are very, very important. We know that very much in COVID-19. People need information to make important decisions. We know it with issues like road safety and so forth. But in addition to campaigns, governments also need to listen in a democratic environment. And the UK Government Communications Service has continued to mostly focus on campaigns, declaring 2019 the year of marketing, for example. And I question that somewhat to say, is government communication mostly about marketing? Research, I found, and this continues in many countries, that a lot of research, a huge amount of research is done in government, but it's mostly quantitative. We love numbers. And there was actually quite a low focus on in-depth qualitative research. And that was one of the issues leading up to the EU referendum, is the government had not done deep, in-depth research to really understand what people were thinking. A lot of it was polling with very small samples and sometimes even quota sampling. Now, public consultation is an area where you would assume that listening is not only part of it, but perhaps should be the predominant purpose of public consultation. And I found a number of issues. Firstly, consultations tended to attract the usual suspects, the major lobby groups, the major organizations, the noisy voices. And that was complicated by the fact that there was no outreach to marginalized groups, to the silent majority. So governments, in the case of this research, I found typically posted consultation sites online and waited passively to see who would make submissions. And of course, it was mostly the power elites that made the most convincing submissions. And without outreach going out to some communities, those communities remained voiceless. There was a lack of acknowledgement of submissions, which was very easily fixed with an auto email function. And most important of all, there was a lack of analysis of the submissions and a lack of reporting back. And I'll give you an example of that. When I arrived in 2016, I discovered that the one of the largest public consultations done in the UK is the NHS mandate. And it had been done the year before, and to my shock, it attracted 127,400 submissions, many of which were 10 or more pages. And so there was almost 1 million pages, if you'd printed these out, of submissions. Now, this is not a criticism of civil servants at all, because what I found is that they had no software and no particular training to be able to analyze 127,400 submissions. They're also given a very short deadline by the minister. That might resonate for some of you. And so it was impossible for them to really properly analyze these public consultation submissions. I was working at London School of Economics and Political Science at the time, where I'm a visiting professor, and they had some technology, but also the University of Sussex at the time was working with Demos to develop a natural language processing, machine learning text analysis program for handling very large volumes of text. So we convinced the developers of the program to come in and work with us. And so they did, and they trained staff within the departments, and we analyzed the 127,400 submissions. And it probably wouldn't surprise you to know that we found 7 major findings from that research. And just one thing to say, if the government had done that analysis earlier, it would never have called the EU referendum because of the nature and the extent of public concern that was out there. Let me quickly just say a few words about the third stage of organizational listening, because as I mentioned, it's with a multinational corporation. It's a brand that you won't be familiar with because Achmea International, doesn't trade under that name. It works through a number of operating companies or subsidiaries, such as Zilver and Chris, which is the health insurance system of the Netherlands. Inter-American is a major insurance group in Greece. Union Postovna in Slovakia, and a small subsidiary in Australia and a few others. What I did there was in Q1 2018, I was invited to come in following, based on the listening research, to review their existing listening activities with a view of the CEOs wanting to improve their engagement with their key stakeholders. In Q2 2018 through to Q1 2019, the companies implemented some of the recommendations to improve listening. And then very importantly, I went back in the Q2 and Q3 of 2019, late last year, to evaluate the results. And I'll share just a couple of those with you. Just for background, the key stakeholders of this organization were, of course, customers. They have 10 million customers, and they have 14,500 employees, as well as a distribution channel of 250 agents and brokers. So particularly customers and employees, very, very important to the organization. Again, I looked at a range of sites where there could be listening, in this case, particularly customer relations and CRM. They do customer satisfaction surveys, and they have a number of call centers, over 1 million calls a year to their call centers. And I looked at marketing, sales, internal, PR, corporate, web and social media communication. This slide is just a quick summary of the methods and tools. Now, I must say I don't endorse or have an interest in any of these tools. As an academic, I'm independent, but these are just some of the tools that they were using. So they were using Net Promoter Score surveys. They were done by a company in Rotterdam called Metrics Lab, but we significantly expanded their existing NPS, and I'll show you how in a moment. They also did a lot of statistical analysis, very common in business, but what we found is they didn't do any text analysis. Now, so we introduced SAS's text analytics modules. Why is that important? Well, very simply, the voice of people is far more often and more in detail expressed in words than it ever is in numbers. If we're only analyzing numbers, we're getting proxies for people's feelings and understandings. People speak in words. Voice is in words. And so we really need a text analysis capability, and I'll give you an example. We didn't like the visual. We needed strong visualization for management, so we brought in Microsoft Power BI. They use an automated website feedback tool, which was acceptable, and it continued. We also, though, as a new initiative, introduced customer journey mapping using some software called Reframer and also a consultancy firm. We continued employee satisfaction surveys, and we significantly increased their media monitoring by introducing qualitative content analysis. Let me quickly, in the remaining moments, take you through what I think are some fairly stunning results and show the value of listening, albeit in a corporate dimension here, but the same kind of results can be achieved for citizen engagement and for people's support for various issues. The first thing we did, I'm only going to give you the example of the NPS surveys of one of the things we did, but the first thing there was we added a number of open-end questions. Very often NPS surveys focus on the numbers, your 0 to 10 score. So we wanted to find out why people were giving the scores they were. So we introduced several open-end questions to the NPS surveys. Then, as I indicated on the previous slide, we introduced text analysis capabilities by bringing in software, and we trained 2 full-time text analysts to be able to analyze that unstructured data. The third thing we did was quite interesting, is we introduced callbacks, not angry callbacks, but we trained up a special team in the call center to make proactive callbacks to the detractors, to the unhappy customers. But bear in mind, when they were calling back, they already had the data from the text analysis, so they knew what the key issues of concern were. Now, don't even try to read this slide. You can't, because it's actually in Greek, and I mean literally in Greek. So this is an example of one of the charts showing text analysis of qualitative feedback we gained through the open-end questions in the NPS surveys. And it's really the concept to show you that on the left-hand side in red are the leading issues identified by detractors, the things that people were most unhappy about. On the right-hand side in green are the things that their customers were most happy about. And so very quickly, this is rich data that those top green bars, if you like, they were issues that the call center staff, the sales staff, all of the organization were told to continue to focus on and make sure we don't abandon those. But equally, we needed to do something about the high volume of unhappy customers, not high volume, but the high volume of messages that were about negative issues and complaints. So here, let me show you some of the maths very quickly. After the callbacks to the detractors, the unhappy customers, we found that 21% converted to be passive. And that was what we expected. We found another 30% remained detractors, no change. But what we found quite surprising was that after one callback to discuss their problem and try to resolve it and show an understanding of it, 48.6% of the detractors converted directly to be promoters. Now, we know that promoters are highly likely to remain customers and detractors are likely to be lost customers. In a government environment, you could think that promoters are highly likely to remain happy, supportive citizens and engaged, and detractors are highly likely to be disengaged or oppositional. Now, this company has, across its group, 17,000 detractors. That sounds like a lot. It's actually a very positive company. It's got only 0.17% of their 10 million customers are detractors. But I'm sure you'd agree, 17,000 customers who are detractors, who are very unhappy, is a significant number. So if 48.6% of those detractors, of those 17,000, that is 8,262, could be converted to promoters and remain customers, multiplied by the customer lifetime value, which is a statistic that the company's own finance department has, because it knows how much the average customer spends over the course of the period that they're a customer. Just simply multiplying that out, you come up with 40 million euro straight to the bottom line. So we were conservative and said, well, look, let's say that only half of those who convert to promoters remain customers. It's still 24 million euro on the bottom line. Now, that's a corporate example, but it's a really interesting example to show the quite dramatic effect that systematic, well-informed listening can have to people that we deal with. And there were many other results. Customer satisfaction increased overall, particularly in their online environment. Employee satisfaction and retention increased. That means reduced training costs and recruitment costs, and productivity in the companies, all of them increased over the period of this research. I'll just quickly share with you in a final moment current research we're doing with the World Health Organization. And this is actually an evaluation project that I'm leading globally in relation to COVID-19 and also all of their World Health Days and other campaigns. The objective of this research is to improve the effectiveness of WHO health communication, and that, of course, is designed to inform that what they're trying to do is inform government policy and decisions with useful information to support health authorities and public education through health promotion. What we're doing with the World Health Organization is we're using some of the same tools as I've shown before. They had traditional media content analysis where they look at reach, the usual things, impressions, key messages. But of course, that's only what's in the media. That doesn't necessarily mean that's in the mind of audiences. So we then introduced more social media analysis, including qualitative analysis. We're analyzing not what they are saying, but what people are saying about COVID-19, about health issues, about polio, about smoking, etc. We're able to start analyzing key target audiences on key issues. We also gather through Google Analytics quite extensive website statistics of who's going to what pages and viewing what content. But very importantly, right now, we're introducing two further steps where we're doing key stakeholder interviews, where we're going out and talking to health authorities in various countries to find out, is what the WHO doing? Is it useful? What could they improve? How could they do better? And then finally, we're also introducing audience surveys to actually find out attitudes and trust and reputation and behavioral responses in the public. And there is enormous learnings even in this NGO environment. For example, we found that initially the WHO focused very heavily on COVID-19, which is understandable, but there was a lot of criticism during that period, including that they were slow to provide information or that they were siding with China. And what we found is when they promoted what we're calling the whole of WHO, when they talked not only about COVID, but reminded people of World Health Days, programs like polio, mental health issues, public opinion and media opinion both increased. So we need to remind people of the total role of the WHO. It wasn't just about China and COVID. We also found, no surprise, that they really needed to address misinformation and disinformation. And we did quite a bit of research to look at how that should be done, because it's a very sensitive step. What works, what might backfire. And that was another important learning for listening to what was being said. We found through listening that use of credible influencers, not always speaking as WHO, but providing information to health authorities, local health workers to mobilize the friends of WHO using an influencer strategy. And finally, we found that we got to tell the story of science, that people did not understand when they saw WHO perhaps change its advice. We needed to educate to inoculate. People don't understand that COVID-19 is a novel virus, and therefore scientific research and medical research had to start from ground zero, and it takes time. And advice will change as knowledge grows. And so we've spent a lot of time then telling the story of science. I'm going to stop there and just dwell slightly on the final slide, which is a lot of words, but you can see it in the slide deck. But it's really just a table summarizing some of those methods of organizational listening. From the left-hand side, starting with social and market research and social media monitoring and analysis, through stakeholder engagement and consultation, but ensuring that we can analyze text through text and content and semantic analysis, even voice to text, because of many phone call centers can convert phone calls to text, right through to more advanced methods like behavioral insights, customer journey mapping, innovative deliberative techniques. And finally, perhaps ultimately, the ultimate expression of listening is when you're engaged in collaboration and co-design and co-production. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I hope this is of some use and perhaps inspirational, and perhaps some of the tools and the systems and the technologies. At the end of the day, there are still humans on the end of the line listening, but in an organizational large-scale environment, we need systems and processes and tools to help us bridge that gap. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure.